Chapter 2, Tillamook, Land of Many Waters. Copyright 1951 by Ada M. Orcutt. Chapter 2, Land of Many Waters. There were 3 Indian tribes in Tillamook County. The Tillamooks, located near Tillamook Bay, the Nehalims in the northern part of the county along the Nehalem River, and the Nestuckas in the southern part of the county along with the Nestucca River. These Indians were the Salishan linguistic group, and geographically removed from their others of their racial strain, most of whom lived north of the present boundary of the United States. The Tillamooks, who gave their name, which means land of many waters, to our county, were not always known as such. True, the various spellings of the same name sounded much the same as we know it today, but Tillamook underwent an interesting evolution. In John H. Frost's journal of 1840 to 1843, the name is spelled Killamooks with a K. Mentioned by Lewis and Clark, the name of the tribe was spelled in their journal Tillamook and Killamox, Kilamox. Alexander Henry spelled the name Killamex. In certain early books on Oregon, the name appears in still other forms. Thus, William P. MacArthur of the United States Coast Survey in 1850 gives Tillamook. However, the petition, submitted by citizens of the region of the territorial legislature in 1853, requested the creation of Tillamook County, used the present spelling of the name. Apparently, the change from the K to the T had become familiar by the time the county was organized. According to Lewis A. MacArthur, the name Nehalem also underwent several changes. Duflot de Mofras gives the name as Nehalem. A Senate executive document of the 32nd Congress gives it as Naalem, Naalem. And Silas B. Smith in Volume 1 of the Oregon Historical Society spells it Nealem, Neaylem. Mrs. Williams, the widow of Bill Williams, informed Mr. Gill that the Indian word for Nehalem meant place where people live, and indicated that the prefix Ne, used frequently in the Indian names of northwestern Oregon, meant a place or locality. The Nestucca Indians took their name from the country in which they lived, but their real tribal name was Stagaush, Stagaush. J. H. Frost in his journal of 1841 used the name Nestucca in referring to a place on Nestucca River. These Indians were not warlike, spectacular type of redmen such as found in other sections of our state and country, but they were, on the whole, peaceful, friendly to the white men who came to take their lands, faithful to their rituals, and they seemed to ask no more than the yearly return of the salmon, and to be left to live out their days in peace. Like most coast Indians, the Tillamooks, Nehalims, and Nestuckas were flathead Indians. This disfigurement was a sign of distinction. To the free-born child of the tribe, it was a birthright, and occasionally the first child of a favorite slave wife was so honored. Silas B. Smith describes the head flattening process as follows. This is a quote. When the baby has been properly wrapped and fastened in its wooden cradle, a little bag, say 4 inches wide and 8 inches long, filled with feathers or some other soft materials, is placed longitudinally upon its head and bound on. It is then nursed to sleep. When it awakens, this in due time is taken off. This treatment is kept up for 8 months or a year, some mothers continuing it even longer than others. The child is always laid on its back during the treatment, and the weight of the feathers causes the head to flatten in its growth, and it is attended with no pain to the child." Unquote. In an interview with John Hathaway, who has been a resident of Tillamook since 1871, he spoke of the Indians as press heads, and he said that they flattened their heads by putting sacks packed with sand upon them. Silas Smith also tells that intermarriage between the flatheads and the not flatheads was not very common. The men of important families usually sought wives from some other flathead tribe than their own. And Mrs. Stasek says in her interview with Jane and Emma Adams that Ilga, one of the best known of the Tillamooks, married a Clatsop maiden. It's interesting to note that although the Flathead Indians waged bitter war against each other, they never captured each other for the purpose of enslavement. If a Flathead found another Flathead in captivity, he would frequently buy the enslaved man to set him free. Philip Parrish calls the Indians of our region Canoe Indians, and it's an appropriate name for them, as the horse has played a leading role in all the lives of the Plains Indians, and later in all the lives of our western cowboys, so the canoe played an important role in the lives of our own Indians. The canoe was their means of transportation, an invaluable aid in obtaining food, and their final resting place. Even their appearance was affected by their canoes. It has been said that the Indians of their coasts were less manly in form and feature than the Indians farther inland, and some have scoffed at their short stature and misshapen legs, but as the bowed legs of the cowboy were the result of hours in the saddle, so probably the bandy legs of the coast Indians were the result of hours in their canoes. In contrast to their legs, the canoe Indians showed abnormal muscular development in their arms and shoulders, which accounts for the masterful way in which they handled their graceful craft. Some of these canoes were for only one paddler. Others needed 40 paddlers and were fit to cross the ocean itself. But they were as graceful a boat as men have ever built. It is said that they were used as the models for the clipper ships upon which the sea by New England builders, which were so famous in the past century. The canoes were dug out of the cedar logs. The finer touches were added by burning." Unquote. Mr. Hathaway told the author in the interview that he remembers seeing canoes 60 feet long, the sides of which would come to the man's waist when he stood up in them. These canoes were carried from 40 to 60 Indians. Their bows were shaped like the horse's head and decorated with shells. Mr. Hathaway says that these canoes, the most beautiful he'd ever seen, came into Tillamook Bay and were manned by flatheads from the south, but he does not remember to what tribe they belonged. Mr. Hathaway also said that the canoes he saw made by the Tillamooks were hollowed out from logs and then steamed and spread. The steaming was done by putting the hot rocks into the canoe and then covering it. Some of the Indians were possessed of incredible skill with these frail craft. Ilga of Tillamook tribe was very skillful with the canoe. He made many trips out over the Tillamook Bar and up the coast into the mighty Columbia with his canoe to trade with the Hudson's Bay Company at Astoria, or Fort George, as it was called back then in 1811 to 1825 when they moved to Vancouver. That he used good judgment in the bargaining and is evident by the fact that his grandchildren and great-grandchildren still have the hardwood chest, a blanket, and many trinkets that he brought from the trading post. Ilga, besides going to Astoria, went to California. Indian Adam was expert hunter and trapper and a true friend. For duck hunting, he had a very small canoe into which he would crouch, lay his gun, which no one but himself could have manipulated. Over his knees, he darted through the tidelands with unbelievable swiftness. He paddled so quickly and sat so low in his tiny canoe that he could ride into the midst of the feeding ducks and the geese. End of quote. Life for these natives was simple, and they followed zealously the custom of their ancestors. These customs covered their entire lives, from the flattening of the heads of their babies to the mourning ceremonies for their dead. At the time of puberty for the girls, they were secluded from the rest of the tribe and forbidden all food and drink for some days, and certain foods were taboo for 1 to several years. They were also forbidden from gambling equipment, fishing streams, and hunting grounds. During the menstrual period of each month, the women were bound with twigs of hemlock or spruce around their bodies. This seems to have been a species of charm. The most elaborate rituals had to do with their dead. When a man, nothing is said about mourning for women, died, his wives, relatives, and slaves went into mourning by cutting their hair and wailing a funeral dirge at sunrise or sunset. Both sunrise and sunset. This wailing for the dead is continued for a long time, and seems rather to be a ceremonial performance than an act of spontaneous grief. The duty of course belonged to the women, and early morning was usually chosen for that purpose. They went out alone to some place distant from the lodge or the camp, and in a loud sobbing voice repeated a sort of stereotype formula. As for instance, a mother on her loss of her child might say, Asib, let's start again. Asib, Shada, Buddha, Atabud, Adeda, Chief, my child dead, alas. When in dreams they saw any of their deceased friends, this lamentation was renewed. End of quote. As to widows in mourning, History of the Pacific Northwest, page 92, is authority for the following description and the etiquette of mourning and the duties of a widow and her mother-in-law. Quote, even a long time after the mourning had ceased, a friend might cry out in mourning at the sight of a garment belonging to a dead person. A woman should go dirty and unkempt as a mark of regard for her husband. To wear good clothes, to be clean and cheerful, and not to howl vehemently were considered voluptuous, and an indication the widow was eager to marry again. Upon the death of her son, the mother brought his widow a present of an animal skin and seated the daughter-in-law upon it. Then the older woman cut the younger woman's hair just above her ears and tied a small bunch above each ear as widow strings, which she must wear from 1 to 3 years. If a mother-in-law did not perform this service, it indicated the widow was not desirable in the family. The mother-in-law cut the hair and returned it at the end of the mourning period. For a long time after the end quote. For a long time after the death of an Indian, his name was not to be mentioned. If he was spoken of, he was referred to as him who died, or my father's brother, or in some such manner. However, several years after her father's death, it was customary for his son to summon his friends to a feast and announce that he had taken his father's name. During the course of this feast, some designated old man would stand up and say that the dead had come and addressed his son by the name of his dead father. The others did the same and received presents, as did the first one. The mortal remains of one for whom all the ritual was practiced were lying in his canoe. Upon his death, he had been placed in his canoe with his belongings, and the canoe placed in the tribal burying ground. There were two of these Indian burying grounds in the lower Kilchis Valley. One was in the little grove at the river's edge near the Peter Morgan house. The other was about 2 miles east of the Jennings place. After the body was placed in the canoe with guns, knives, and other belongings, it was covered with another canoe and set up on low blocks. When Mr. John Hathaway was a young fellow, he and his friends, needing a boat in a hurry, took one of the canoes hastily and rattled the contents onto the beach and washed out the canoe and went on with their way. The Indians were very, very angry at them, of course, but nothing happened, so the act was repeated at intervals during the following years. Although Mr. Hathaway got away with an Indian burial canoe and his hide all in one piece, there was nothing that the Indians resented more and aroused his hatred more quickly than interference with the dead. Now, just for the record, too, off Tillamook Head, Cape Meares, there's something called the octopus tree. When I was a little kid, it used to have all these arms before a storm blew it down. And they claimed that when the pioneers first came out, they found a canoe with a body in it up in that tree. So, alright, back to the story. Mr. William Coates told the author that there is a place on the southwestern shore of Tillamook Bay known as Mamaloose Point. Mamaloose means place of the dead, where Indian remains have been found. There is also an Indian burial ground on the Neatart Spit, and some are located in the northern part of the county. The Indians of Tillamook County, like many other places, believe their supreme being, Achane, and many subordinate gods. The greatest of these subordinate gods was Talipas, Talipas, or Talapas, Talapus, trickster and transformer god, who is allied with all developments of culture along the coast Indians. Talapas, meaning coyote, was said to have come to the Indians in the form of cunning coyote and taught them to make canoes, catch salmon, etc. The personal gods were called. Oh, by the way, that sounds exactly like ancient stories of Thoth. Well, he's under different names. Thoth with the Egyptians, Quetzalcoatl with the Aztecs, the plumed serpent with the Mayans, Thoth with the Norwegians, and so anyways, he has all kinds of different names, and he was the god of like learning and stuff, and he helped out all these different cultures, so that's very interesting. Alright, back to the story. The personal gods were called Tamanawas or Tuanas, which meant oneness with the powers of nature, and he who possessed it was according as able to accomplish great things. Some possessors of Tamanawas were supposed to be able to cause storms, have power over wild beasts, etc. All medicine men had to possess this personal favor with the gods, but others could have it too. These Indians believed in immortality of the soul, and believed that spirits of animals as well as people go to spirit land. The medicine men were in some ways all powerful, but in other respects their lives were precarious ones. As long as they could awe their fellow tribesmen with their charms, as long as the salmon returned to the streams, and as long as their patients recovered, they were powerful men in their tribes. However, there was usually an apprentice man in the tribe, and if the old medicine man failed in his duty, he was immediately replaced. John Hathaway told Mrs. Stasek of attending the Indian dances while they made medicine men, which they did quite often. Should a patient die, the medicine man was soon found dead also. Indian Samson was the last medicine man of the Tillamooks. He failed in an attempt to cure a patient, whereupon his fellow tribesmen laid a long pole across his neck, and they sat upon it, and thus he was found. The big event of the year for our red men of Tillamook was the return of the salmon. It was an event for great rejoicing after the first salmon had been taken. But it was also an event of great seriousness, for if the salmon did not return to the rivers, the winter would indeed be a hard one for the Tillamooks, Nehalims, and the Nestuckas. In the manner of taking the first salmon and preparing it, they had been carefully instructed, so that they believed, by their cunning god Telepas, the medicine man of the tribe, drew in the first net. The first salmon were to be taken to the lodge and laid with their heads to the west until towards night, when the fire was prepared, and then they cut the fish according to what they believed to be the instructions given by their god. For this was the first salmon caught in the spring, and must never be dressed or cooked until after sunset. Everything might be in readiness for the feast, but it must wait until the sun had left the western sky. If any of them should touch a dead body, or if any dead body should be above ground, or eat vermin until the strawberries began to ripen, the salmon would all leave the river, unless those who had thus defiled themselves should be prohibited from touching a salmon for the specified number of days, and that the same results would follow. If there were women under certain circumstances who were also prohibited from enjoying this privilege of the houses, should look upon a salmon net, and that until the time arrived when the berries began to ripen, which is about the time 1st of June, they must cook the salmon precisely the same way, and none of it must be taken out of the lodge in which it was cooked. But as soon as the specified time arrived, they were at liberty to cook the salmon as they might see proper, and sell them to whom they pleased, because their gods presided over this all-important run of fish. They must never give the heart of the salmon to a dog, because the dog had a base nature, and would invoke the displeasure of the god. The salmon was prepared by boiling and steaming in the latter manner, used in preparing many types of seafood. A hole was dug in the ground, and stones were placed over the fire. When the fire had burned out and the stones became very hot, the fish was placed on the hot stones and covered over with seaweed, mats, and dirt, leaving only a small place at the top, through which they poured some water. Then the remaining opening is closed, and the fish steamed until done. The houses in which they lived were quite different from the traditional Indian wigwam or teepee, for here on the northwest coast was the only place in North America where the Indians learned to make good wooden houses. The sides of these houses were tight and well built, but cracks were purposely left in the roof to allow the smoke from their fires to escape. The size of the house depended upon the wealth of the family, or families that lived in it. Often there were 3 or 4 families in each house. Sometimes the chief had many slaves and many wives, so he would have a big house for his own use. The largest of the Indian villages was located at the top of the Kelch's Point, and consisted of about 4 or 5 rows of queer-looking shacks. Various kinds of materials were used in the construction. These houses did not leak. They followed the usual custom of digging out the center of the dirt floor, leaving a bench-like space about 3 or 4 feet wide along each wall. This was covered with mats, blankets, and skins, and was used for beds at night, while in the daytime they sat along the edge as we use a chair or a bench. In the corner was a fire, with the usual outlet for the smoke at the center of the peak of the roof. All that remains to mark the site of that village are rows of slight hollows where the houses once stood. The favorite pastime of the Tillamooks, Nehalims, and Nestuckas, as it was with most of the coast Indians, was gambling. This sport was indulged in by both men and women. The women had their own game, and although they might watch the gambling of the men with interest, they never entered their game. The men gambled with a bundle of gaming sticks, one of which was marked. The man holding the sticks divided them into two bundles, one in each hand. The bets were placed on each bundle and contained the marked stick. There were 4 marked beaver teeth in the game that the women played. Often the men gambled away everything that they owned. These Indians were also fond of horse racing. Mr. Fred Christensen, who was born in Orcutt, told the author that his father, in need of laborers for his oyster industry, engaged in horse racing with the Nestucca Indians in order to win their interest in working for him. Perhaps the greatest artistry of the Indians in his region was their basket weaving. The common bulrush or cattail flag was used for the purpose of what was called Liscus tipso, or mat grass. This was cut during the months of July and August and carefully dried in the sun, and when in proper state, this was stowed away in some dry place until the fall or winter, when the rains kept them at work indoors. In making these mats, pegs were driven into the earth to hold the binders, and the needle was used was a second joint from the wing of a blue crane, with a hole drilled in it for an eye. Mrs. Tillamook tells us that these Indians were experts at the art of basket weaving. These baskets were used for many purposes and ranged from the heavy clam baskets made of spruce roots to the cooking baskets woven so tightly that they held water, to the ornamental type that some were sold to white settlers. They also made mats from the reeds of coarse grasses found in swampy places. Lewis and Clark estimated that in 1806 the Tillamook Indians numbered at least 1,000. From this figure, their population decreased in 1871. There were only 28 Nehalims and 56 Clatsops left, included among the Tillamooks by the Lewis and Clark estimate. 83 Tillamooks and 55 Nestuckas still living on their original tribal lands. What caused this drastic reduction in the population? Disease, the white man's curse on the red. Francis Fuller Victor tells of an epidemic that apparently originated with the Indians around the Columbia, where their ship was anchored, and spread down the coast as far as the San Francisco Bay. That epidemic was believed to have carried off about 30,000 Indians on the Pacific coast. The noted botanist David Douglas said in his reference to his entrance on the Columbia River on October 11th, 1830, a dreadfully fatal intermittent fever broke out in the lower parts of the river about 11 weeks ago, which depopulated the country. Villages which had afforded from 1 to 200 effective warriors are totally gone. Not a soul remains. The houses are empty, and the flocks are famished. And the flocks of famished dogs are howling about, while the dead bodies lie strewn in every direction on the sands of the river. It would be almost impossible to believe that the epidemic did not touch the Indians of Tillamook County directly to the south. At the time of the coming of the first white men to Tillamook, there were 2 leaders among the Tillamook Indians, Ilga and Chief Kilchis. The story of the Ilga, or Adams, family is best told by the Margaret Stasek in her interview with Jane and Emma Adams, the daughters of Ilga. Some of that story has already been referred to in the preceding pages of the chapter. Ilga met and married a Clatsop maiden who had been held captive. Her parents were killed, and she was taken to a convent near Yamhill until reclaimed by her relatives. She wore clothes like a white woman instead of a grass skirt, such as the Tillamooks wore. She could sew a little, make bread, bake it on the rocks before